Hello and welcome to Byju's IAS. Let's take up the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper by looking at a column from page number 7 of the Delhi edition. In this column, the writer calls for protecting and preserving India's unique geological heritage. The writer says that India has a very rich geological diversity represented by a variety of geological and physical elements, which includes mountain structures such as the Himalayas, the Vindhyas, the Western Ghats, or the deep valleys and gorges, or the landforms and landscapes, or the long coastline of India, or the hot springs and the active volcanoes. These geological physical elements of nature represent the geological diversity of India, and we should treat this as a part of our geological heritage and protect and preserve this heritage just like we protect and preserve our biodiversity and cultural heritage. Because these unique geological sites, they act as natural laboratories which can help in geoscientific learning and in our understanding of geological evolution and as well as human evolution. Say in geography, you would have studied about continental drift theory, according to which the Indian subcontinent broke away from the Gondwana superland mass nearly 150 million years ago and started drifting northwards before finally crashing into the Asian continent. This is what creates the landmass of today's India, and over millions and billions of years, several unique geological features and landscapes have evolved after going through repeated cycles of tectonic movement, climate change, and subsequent weathering and adaptation. These important geological landmarks, they contain evidence not just about the geological transformation that has taken place, but also about the evolution of various species, including human beings, and about how life on Earth has adapted and evolved with changing geological and climatological circumstances. Today in India, there are several such important geological sites, which includes Kutch in Gujarat, which is home to dinosaur fossils of the Jurassic era, and preserving and learning from this site would be of global significance. Then we have Tiruchirappalli in Tamil Nadu, which was originally part of a Mesozoic ocean, and it would be a great place to learn about Cretaceous marine fossils that date back to 60 million years. Then the Indus River Valley in today's India and Pakistan is a perfect example of how physical geography can transform into a cultural entity. This geological site gave birth to one of the first progressive human civilizations, which forms the very foundation of India's cultural and civilizational heritage. So, the physical geography of Indus River Valley did play a direct role in the evolution of the Indus Valley civilization, thereby giving India its rich cultural heritage. So, protecting these geological sites and studying them is of great significance, not just from a conservation and environment point of view, but also with regard to anthropology and cultural studies. Hence, the writer argues that such important geological sites should be designated as geoheritage sites, which can serve as an educational space, which can help in the geoscientific understanding of our geography and history. But unfortunately, in India, the government and the education sector have largely ignored studies related to environmental science and geology, and this lack of general interest in treating geoheritage sites as a part of our geoscientific learning is very unfortunate, especially at a time when we are facing the threats and uncertainties of global warming and climate change. It is ignorant on our part to not show interest in geological studies because these geological heritage sites contain evidence about the numerous cycles of climate change and the subsequent adaptation by life forms that have taken place in the past. For example, we can study the Miocene epoch, which was seen 23 to 5 million years ago, and it was a warming phase when the global climate underwent a change, and accordingly the life forms adapted, and those evidences are preserved in several important geoheritage sites. So today, as we face the threat of global warming and climate change, the understanding of past events can be immensely useful. But for that, we need to protect and preserve our geological heritage and promote greater awareness by mainstreaming geological studies in education and by marking these geoheritage sites as memorial sites. In this regard, a few global efforts have already been made. First, in 1991, the UNESCO organized the first ever international symposium on the conservation of our geological heritage. This symposium, held at a place known as Digne in France, led to the Digne Resolution, which for the first time recognized that man and earth share a common heritage, and today it is us and our governments which are the custodians of this heritage, and hence it was recognized that there was a need to conserve our geological heritage by establishing geoparks. This later led the UNESCO to launch a global initiative known as the Global Geoparks Network, similar to UNESCO's World Heritage Program or its Man and Biosphere Program. Under UNESCO's World Heritage Program, several natural and cultural sites have been recognized as UNESCO World Heritage Sites. Then, under the Man and Biosphere Program, biosphere reserves around the world have been given UNESCO recognition in order to enable better protection and preservation of these sites. On similar lines, for the protection and preservation of geological heritage, UNESCO launched the Global Geoparks Network, and today there are around 169 geoparks located in 44 countries. Countries like Vietnam and Thailand, they have even come out with their own national legislations and policies to protect and preserve these geological sites, which have been recognized as UNESCO Global Geoparks. India is also one of the signatories to the UNESCO Global Geopark Network, but unfortunately, we still do not have a single geopark. In India, there is no UNESCO recognized geopark, and the Indian government hasn't come out with any law or policy that specifically provides for geological conservation. However, the Geological Survey of India has recognized 32 important geological sites in India and has listed them as National Geological Monuments. Recently, India has even proposed to the UNESCO to recognize the Kutch region in Gujarat as the first possible UNESCO Global Geopark of India. But however, the delayed action of the Indian government has threatened the well-being of many of these geological sites, especially by developmental activities. Large-scale unplanned infrastructure development and encroachment and haphazard construction by the real estate industry, and as well as illegal unscientific mining, are posing the biggest threats for India's geological heritage. The writer even gives out a few examples to show how important geological sites have been degraded due to developmental activities. For example, in the Kutch region of Gujarat, high concentration of iridium has been found, which provides evidence for a massive meteorite impact that possibly caused the extinction of dinosaurs around 65 million years ago. But this site hasn't been protected enough, and upon that, the geological site has been degraded by a railway project in the region. Then in Ajmer, Rajasthan, there exists a national geological monument where we have a unique rock called the Nephilim Syenite, which unfortunately has been destroyed due to a road widening project. Then you might have heard about the Lonar Impact Crater, which is a very popular lake in Maharashtra, and even this popular geological site has been degraded due to unregulated tourism and lack of conservation efforts by the state government and the center. But fortunately, the Maharashtra High Court recently intervened and has directed the government to take up conservation activities to protect the geological heritage of the Lonar Impact Crater. So, considering the scientific and cultural significance of India's geoheritage diversity, it is of utmost importance for India to immediately bring out a legislation and a national policy to conserve and protect these sites. India will have to work closely with the UNESCO to get the Global Geopark recognition for India's national geological monuments. Now let's take up a column from page number 6, written by Kailash Satyarthi, the Nobel Peace Laureate. He was recognized with the Nobel Peace Prize for his fight against child labor and for his immense contribution in the field of child welfare. So in this column, he argues that right to health should be made a fundamental right in India considering the important lessons that we have drawn from the pandemic. As we all know, the pandemic led to the collapse of healthcare systems around the world, and even India was severely hit during the first and the second waves of the pandemic. India's weak healthcare system and the lack of timely intervention by the government pushed the marginalized classes into deep misery as their out of pocket medical expenditure went up significantly, thereby threatening their financial security. Especially the poor people, migrant workers, unorganized sector, they were severely hit by rising medical expenses along with falling income as a result of the economic disruption caused by the pandemic. So, in this context, the writer says that the government of India should draw important lessons from the pandemic and push towards a constitutional amendment so that right to health for all can be included as a fundamental constitutional right. In this context, it's very important to trace the constitutional history of the subject of public health. See, it was the Nehru Report of 1928 which made the first reference to public health as a constitutional right. Under the Fundamental Rights section, the Nehru Report mandated that maintaining the health and fitness for work of all citizens should be recognized as a fundamental right. Then, 3 years later, in 1931, the Karachi Resolution also contained a similar provision which mainly focused on the health of industrial workers in order to create healthy conditions for work as a fundamental right. In addition to this, maternity leave was also sought for women, and children were prohibited from working in hazardous industries. Then in 1944, when M.N. Roy and Mahatma Gandhi expressed their version of constitution, even they saw promotion of public health and sanitation as a fundamental right that should be enshrined in the constitution. The Gandhian constitution contained two fundamental rights related to public health. The first gave citizens a right to rest and not be compelled to work for more than 8 hours a day, which again highlighted the focus on the health of industrial workers. The second right referred to the fundamental right of every citizen to have medical freedom, and a similar position was later taken in 1948 by the Socialist Party of India, which brought out a draft constitution as a recommendation to the Constituent Assembly. This document contained a section titled Economic Rights, under which the employment of women and children in conditions detrimental to their health was prohibited. Finally, when the Constituent Assembly held debates and discussions on the subject of public health, it was decided not to include right to health as a fundamental right. Considering the limited resources and the capabilities of the newly independent government of India, right to health was not recognized as a fundamental right in the Indian Constitution that was adopted in 1950. But however, these principles that were brought out in previous reports were included in the final constitution as a part of the directive principles of state policy. For example, we have Article 39 Clause E, which mandates the state that the health and strength of workers, men and women, and the tender age of children should not be abused, and citizens should not be forced by economic necessity to enter into avocations which are unsuited to their age or strength. Then Article 47 places a duty on the state to raise the nutrition levels and as well as the standard of living of people in the country. It considers public health as a primary duty of the state and prohibits the sale and consumption of intoxicating drinks and drugs. But however, as you might know, the directive principles are not enforceable, unlike a fundamental right which can be enforced through courts. Hence, the writer suggests that considering the immense suffering caused by the pandemic, especially to the marginalized classes, it is imperative for India to strengthen its healthcare system by recognizing the right to health for all as a fundamental right. He points out that such a constitutional provision would particularly help the farmers, women and children, and as well as the unorganized workers. Farmers, even though they help fulfill right to life under Article 21 by being the primary producers of food, their own right to life is under threat as a result of their economic insecurity, which is further aggravated by increasing out-of-pocket medical expenditure. Especially small and marginalized farmers, the landless, the seasonal workers, the migrant workers, they are facing the greatest risk as a result of India's failing healthcare system. Women as well, they have to bear a disproportionate burden of the gaps in our healthcare system. Because in a patriarchal society where taboos and superstition directly affects the health and well-being of women, it is of utmost importance to secure their sexual and reproductive rights by ensuring that right to healthcare for all is a fundamental right. The same applies for children as well, especially to malnourished children and children who are pushed into bonded labor and trafficking. For such children, a fundamental right to health will help in their transition from the exploitative conditions that they face into a safer and secure future. While the writer appreciates the government for coming out with ambitious schemes such as Ayushman Bharat, he points out that such limited targeted schemes are not sufficient to meet the healthcare challenges of the country because many of these schemes don't translate into real impact on the ground and many of the benefits don't actually reach the grassroots in a corrupt system. So, if right to healthcare for all is guaranteed as a fundamental right, it will not only improve the health standards, especially that of the marginalized classes, but it will also guarantee them financial security and livelihood security. Because one, it will reduce their out of pocket medical expenditure, and two, a healthier individual will be able to work more efficiently, thereby securing his livelihood. This in turn will collectively contribute to the overall growth and development of the nation. And if right to health is recognized as a fundamental right, it will have the same transformative impact as the right to education had on the education sector. Now let's look at this article from page number 1, which refers to the 13th round of talks between senior military commanders of India and China to resolve the border dispute that has flared up in the Ladakh sector since last year. These talks have ended with an impasse, and both the sides have blamed each other for the deadlock in the negotiations. See, beginning from May 2020, the Chinese PLA carried out multiple simultaneous incursions across the line of actual control in several areas claimed by India, including Gogra, Penongso Lake, Hot Springs and Galwan River Valley, Depsang Plains, and Demchok. These incursions have led to heightened border tensions between the two countries and even almost brought the two countries to the brink of war. Because these tensions led to the Galwan River Valley clashes last year, in which several soldiers on both the sides were killed, thus resulting in a severe escalation of the crisis. Since then, several rounds of talks and negotiations have been taking place as per the established protocols and agreements which have been signed between India and China, which provide for maintaining peace and tranquility along the LAC by carrying out de-escalation and disengagement. As per these protocols and agreements, several political, diplomatic and military dialogues have taken place, and last year in August, at Gogra, de-escalation and disengagement was achieved, followed by de-escalation and disengagement at the Penongso Lake. But the dispute around Hot Springs, Depsang Plains and Demchok continues till this day, and both the sides have blamed each other for the failure of the latest round of talks between senior military commanders. India has maintained that it is China which has made an illegal attempt to change the status quo, whereas China blames the continuation of the crisis on India's unreasonable demands. But what is alarming is that as the stalemate continues, both the sides have continued with their troop build-up along with infrastructure build-up along the LAC, which has led to the continued deployment of troops on both the sides in these high-altitude areas. Recently, during the SCO summit, the foreign ministers of India and China had pledged to follow the laid down protocols and agreements, and accordingly they were supposed to work out a de-escalation and disengagement at all the remaining disputed areas. But as both the sides have a different perception as to who triggered the crisis and as to what exactly is the alignment of the line of actual control, the latest round of talks also has ended in a deadlock where both the sides ended up blaming each other for the continuation of the crisis. In a related editorial on page number 6, The Hindu calls this deadlock as dangerous because it shows that the established border agreements are in complete disarray and they're not being respected, especially by the Chinese side. And along with that, heavy troop deployment has continued along the LAC, which increases the risk of a conflict between the two countries. As we speak, tens of thousands of soldiers on both the sides are facing off each other for the second winter season, and as the standoff continues, it increases the risk of triggering a far bigger escalation. The Indian side has maintained, after the 13th round of talks between senior military commanders, that the Indian army actually made constructive suggestions to the Chinese side, and it was China that didn't agree to the proposals and did not provide any forward looking proposals either. The Chinese PLA, on the other hand, has blamed India for the crisis and has accused India of making unreasonable and unrealistic demands. So, this clearly shows the trust deficit between the two sides, and it explains why the border tensions have spread from Ladakh to other sectors such as Uttarakhand and Tawang in Arunachal Pradesh. So, as the standoff continues at the Hot Springs area and Depsang Plains and Demchok, the previously established border agreements are falling apart, which significantly increases the risk of a conflict as both the sides have continued their troop build-up along the border, and especially China has mobilized thousands of troops along the border, along with creating military infrastructure very close to the border. See, there are three key agreements that have been signed between India and China to maintain peace and tranquility along the border. In 1993, the historic Peace and Tranquility Agreement was signed that provides for de-escalation in case of border tensions. In 1996, another agreement was signed on maintaining CBMs or confidence building measures along the disputed border in order to avoid misunderstandings and accidents. In 2013, the Border Defense Cooperation Agreement was signed to further prevent and contain the escalation of any crisis situation which might arise as a result of the differing perceptions that both the sides have with regard to the alignment of the India-China border. Previously, whenever incursions used to happen and when tensions used to escalate, as per these established agreements and protocols, both the sides were working on disengagement and de-escalation. But this time, China has been very adamant, and it has not only changed the status quo on the ground, but even as it continues to occupy Indian territory in these disputed sites, it has started mobilizing more troops, and it has been disinclined to accept India's constructive suggestions to achieve this disengagement and de-escalation. So as China is contributing to the breakdown of established border agreements between India and China, the situation along the LAC and the disputed border will escalate further, and hence the editorial remarks that the current stalemate is a dangerous deadlock. Now let's look at a column from page number 7 that deals with the climate crisis. See, in previous classes, we have spoken about the 6th assessment report of the IPCC, or the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which was brought out recently. The report has presented certain alarming facts backed by scientific evidence to show that climate change and global warming are accelerating and we are almost reaching an irreversible situation. As a result, extreme weather events are expected to go up in frequency and intensity around the world, and hence there is tremendous pressure to speed up mitigation and adaptation efforts. According to the IPCC report, in the last 1 decade, the global temperatures have increased by 1.09 degrees Celsius as compared to the warming witnessed between 1850 and 1900. The report also alarmingly points out that very soon we are likely to breach the cap of 1.5 degrees Celsius, beyond which climate change is set to become irreversible. The report also contains specific warnings for countries like India with regard to extreme weather events, and accordingly, India has been ranked 7th in 2021 on the Global Climate Risk Index. It shows how vulnerable India is to the impact of extreme weather events that are driven by climate change and global warming. So in this regard, it's very important to speed up the mitigation and adaptation measures, where mitigation refers to those efforts that are designed and intended to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and adaptation measures refer to those efforts which are aimed at building resilience at the community level to help them adapt to the adverse impacts of climate change. In this regard, India has been doing fairly well because India is well on its way to achieve the intended nationally determined contributions or the voluntary contributions that India had brought out as a part of its commitments to the Paris Agreement of the Climate Change Convention. India is well on its way to achieve its target of 450 gigawatts of installed renewable energy capacity by 2030. It has even launched mega solar and hydrogen missions in order to bring down its greenhouse gas emissions. Then the Niti Aayog has been championing the Shunya program, which aims to accelerate the adoption of electric vehicles in order to promote cleaner technologies so that India's emission footprint can be reduced. India has even put in place a few dedicated initiatives, such as the National Action Plan on Climate Change, and has even set up the National Adaptation Fund in order to raise finances for adaptation activities at the grassroots. But however, the writer points out that these efforts undertaken by India are not sufficient, considering the alarming facts that have been brought out by the latest IPCC report. Hence, the writer offers a few suggestions to promote adaptation and resilience in India by aligning our development agenda with our climate change objectives. Since the poor and marginalized classes are going to be the most vulnerable to the impact of climate change, the government efforts towards adaptation and resilience should focus on the local communities in order to reduce their vulnerability and exposure. So, to promote adaptation and resilience amongst the vulnerable classes, India will have to focus on improving its early warning and forecasting systems so that we are adequately geared up for extreme weather events, and this would go a long way into building disaster resilience into our local communities. Second, India will have to focus on sustainable production systems and push the economy towards environment friendly products by promoting behavioral changes and lifestyle adaptations amongst the citizens. Third, we also have to promote the participation of the private sector in cleaner and renewable forms of technology, and innovative climate solutions will have to be found for all key sectors such as agriculture, healthcare, infrastructure, etc. Then, to adapt and build resilience against extreme weather events, we need to focus on our forests and as well as on our mangrove cover and recover the lost forest areas to build natural resilience for local communities. The government will also have to come out with social protection schemes which are protected against the impact of climate change so that they continue delivering socio-economic benefits to the vulnerable classes. Then the government will also have to put in place a feedback mechanism so that the climate action efforts are continuously monitored, and based on the feedback received, a correction can be introduced mid-course. All of this would require micro-level planning, which has to be led by the state governments, and these state-level plans will have to help determine resource allocation and the response of the state during these hazard events, depending on the different levels of intensities of climate hazards. Now let's look at the mains practice questions. The first question: India's geodiversity, or the variety of geological and physical elements of nature, is unique. Preserving this geological heritage is as important as safeguarding biodiversity and cultural heritage. Discuss. The second question: evaluate the need for the constitutional right to health for all. Kindly write an answer to these questions and post your answers in the answer rating portal, for which the link shall be shared in the description box below. So this concludes our discussion for today. Thanks for watching.